Chapter 12. Light thickens, and the crow makes wing to the rooky wood. Good things of day begin to droop and drowse, while night's black agents to their praise do rouse. Macbeth. Meanwhile, Count de Villefort and Lady Blanche had passed a pleasant fortnight at the Château de Sainte-Foy with the Baron and Baroness, during which they made frequent excursions among the mountains, and were delighted with the romantic wildness of the Pyrenean scenery. It was with regret that the Count bade adieu to his old friends, although with the hope of being soon united with them in one family, for it was settled that Monsieur Sainte-Foy, who now attended them into Gascony, should receive the hand of the Lady Blanche upon their arrival at Château-le-Blanc. As the road from the Baron's residence to La Vallée was over some of the wildest track of the Pyrenees, and where a carriage wheel had never passed, the Count hired mules for himself and his family, as well as a couple of stout guides who were well armed, informed of all the passes of the mountains, and who boasted too that they were acquainted with every brake and dingle on the way, could tell the names of all the highest points of this chain of Alps, knew every forest that spread along the narrow valleys, the shallowest part of every torrent they must cross, and the exact distance of every goatherd's and hunter's cabin they should have occasion to pass, which last article of learning required no very capacious memory, for even such simple inhabitants were but thinly scattered over these wilds. The Count left the Château de Sainte-Foy early in the morning with an intention of passing the night at a little inn upon the mountains about halfway to La Vallée, of which his guides had informed him. And though this was frequented chiefly by Spanish muleteers on their route into France, and of course would afford only sorry accommodation, the Count had no alternative, for it was the only place like an inn on the road. After a day of admiration and fatigue, the travelers found themselves about sunset in a woody valley, overlooked on every side by abrupt heights. They had proceeded for many leagues without seeing a human habitation, and had only heard now and then, at a distance, the melancholy tinkling of a sheep bell. But now they caught the notes of merry music, and presently saw within a little green recess among the rocks a group of mountaineers tripping through a dance. The Count, who could not look upon the happiness any more than on the misery of others with indifference, halted to enjoy this scene of simple pleasure. The group before him consisted of French and Spanish peasants, the inhabitants of a neighboring hamlet, some of whom were performing a sprightly dance, the women with castanets in their hands, to the sounds of a lute and a tambourine, till from the brisk melody of France the music softened into a slow movement to which two female peasants danced a Spanish Pavan. The Count, comparing this with the scenes of such gaiety as he had witnessed at Paris, where false taste painted the features, and, while it vainly tried to supply the glow of nature, concealed the charms of animation, where affectation so often distorted the air, and vice perverted the manners, sighed to think that natural graces and innocent pleasures flourished in the wilds of solitude, while they drooped amidst the concourse of polished society. But the lengthening shadows reminded the travellers that they had no time to lose, and, leaving the joyous group, they pursued their way towards the little inn which was to shelter them from the night. The rays of the setting sun now threw a yellow gleam upon the forests of pine and chestnut that swept down the lower region of the mountains, and gave resplendent tints to the snowy points above. But soon even this light faded fast, and the scenery assumed a more tremendous appearance, invested with the obscurity of twilight. Where the torrent had been seen, it was now only heard. Where the wild cliffs had displayed every variety of form and attitude, a dark mass of mountains now alone appeared, and the vale which far, far below had opened its dreadful chasm, the eye could no longer fathom. A melancholy gleam still lingered on the summits of the highest Alps, overlooking the deep repose of evening, and seeming to make the stillness of the hour more awful. Blanche viewed the scene in silence, and listened with enthusiasm to the murmur of the pines that extended in dark lines along the mountains, and to the faint voice of the izzard among the rocks that came at intervals on the air. But her enthusiasm sank into apprehension when, as the shadows deepened, she looked upon the doubtful precipice that bordered the road, as well as on the various fantastic forms of danger that glimmered through the obscurity beyond it. And she asked her father how far they were from the inn, and whether he did not consider the road to be dangerous at this late hour. The Count repeated the first question to his guides, who returned a doubtful answer, adding that when it was darker it would be safest to rest till the moon rose. "It is scarcely safe to proceed now," said the Count, but the guides, assuring him that there was no danger, went on. Blanche, revived by this assurance, again indulged a pensive pleasure as she watched the progress of twilight gradually spreading its tints over the woods and mountains, and stealing from the eye every minute feature of the scene till the grand outlines of nature alone remained. Then fell the silent dews, and every wild flower and aromatic plant that bloomed among the cliffs breathed forth its sweetness. Then, too, when the mountain bee had crept into its blossomed bed, and the hum of every little insect that had floated gaily on the sunbeam was hushed, the sound of many streams, not heard till now, murmured at a distance. The bats alone, of all the animals inhabiting this region, seemed awake, and while they flitted across the silent path which Blanche was pursuing, she remembered the following lines which Emily had given to her. To the bat. From haunt of man, from day's obtrusive glare, thou shroudest thee in the ruin's ivied tower, or in some shadowy glen's romantic bower, where wizard forms their mystic charms prepare, where horror lurks, and ever boding care, but at the sweet and silent evening hour, when closed in sleep is every languid flower, thou lov'st to sport upon the twilight air, mocking the eye that would thy course pursue. In many a wanton round, elastic gay, thou flit'st athwart the pensive wanderer's way. As his lone footsteps print the mountain dew, from Indian isles thou com'st with summer's car, twilight thy love, thy guide her beaming star. To a warm imagination, the dubious forms that float half-veiled in darkness afford a higher delight than the most distinct scenery that the sun can show. While the fancy thus wanders over landscapes, partly of its own creation, a sweet complacency steals upon the mind, and refines it all to subtlest feeling, bids the tear of rapture roll. The distant note of a torrent, the weak trembling of the breeze among the woods, or the far-off sound of a human voice, now lost and heard again, are circumstances which wonderfully heighten the enthusiastic tone of the mind. The young sang-froid, who saw the presentations of a fervid fancy, and felt whatever enthusiasm could suggest, sometimes interrupted the silence which the rest of the party seemed by mutual consent to preserve, remarking and pointing out to Blanche the most striking effect of the hour upon the scenery, while Blanche, whose apprehensions were beguiled by the conversation of her lover, yielded to the taste so congenial to his, and they conversed in a low, restrained voice, the effect of the pensive tranquillity which twilight and the scene inspired, rather than of any fear that they should be heard. But while the heart was thus soothed to tenderness, sang-froid gradually mingled with his admiration of the country a mention of his affection, and he continued to speak, and Blanche to listen, till the mountains, the woods, and the magical illusions of twilight were remembered no more. The shadows of evening soon shifted to the gloom of night, which was somewhat anticipated by the vapors that, gathering fast round the mountains, rolled in dark wreaths along their sides, and the guides proposed to rest till the moon should rise, adding that they thought a storm was coming on. as they looked round for a spot that might afford some kind of shelter, an object was perceived obscurely through the dusk on the point of a rock a little way down the mountain, which they imagined to be a hunter's or a shepherd's cabin, and the party with cautious steps proceeded towards it. Their labour, however, was not rewarded, or their apprehensions soothed, for on reaching the object of their search they discovered a monumental cross, which marked the spot to have been polluted by murder. The darkness would not permit them to read the inscription, but the guides knew this to be a cross raised to the memory of a Count de Belliard, who had been murdered here by a horde of banditti that had infested this part of the Pyrenees a few years before, and the uncommon size of the monument seemed to justify the supposition that it was erected for a person of some distinction. Blanche shuddered as she listened to some horrid particulars of the Count's fate, which one of the guides related in a low restrained tone, as if the sound of his own voice frightened him. But while they lingered at the cross, attending to his narrative, a flash of lightning glanced upon the rocks, thunder muttered at a distance, and the travellers, now alarmed, quitted this scene of solitary horror in search of shelter. Having regained their former track, the guides, as they passed on, endeavoured to interest the Count by various stories of robbery and even of murder, which had been perpetrated in the very places they must unavoidably pass, with accounts of their own dauntless courage and wonderful escapes. Or rather, he who was the most completely armed, drawing forth one of the 4 pistols that were tucked into his belt, swore that it had shot 3 robbers within the year. He then brandished a clasp knife of enormous length, and was going to recount the wonderful execution it had done, when Sainte-Foy, perceiving that Blanche was terrified, interrupted him. The Count, meanwhile, secretly laughing at the terrible histories and extravagant boastings of the man, resolved to humour him, and, telling Blanche in a whisper his design, began to recount some exploits of his own, which infinitely exceeded any related by the guide. To these surprising circumstances he so artfully gave the colouring of truth that the courage of the guides was visibly affected by them, who continued silent long after the Count had ceased to speak. The loquacity of the chief hero thus laid asleep, the vigilance of his eyes and ears seemed more thoroughly awakened, for he listened with much appearance of anxiety to the deep thunder which murmured at intervals, and often paused, as the breeze that was now rising rushed among the pines. But when he made a sudden halt before a tuft of cork trees that projected over the road, and drew forth a pistol before he would venture to brave the banditti which might lurk behind it, the Count could no longer refrain from laughter. Having now, however, arrived at a level spot, somewhat sheltered from the air by overhanging cliffs, and by a wood of larch that rose over a precipice on the left, and the guides being yet ignorant how far they were from the inn, the travellers determined to rest till the moon should rise or the storm disperse. Blanche, recalled to a sense of the present moment, looked on the surrounding gloom with terror, but giving her hand to Sainte-Foy, she alighted, and the whole party entered a kind of cave, if such it could be called, which was only a shallow cavity formed by the curve of impending rocks. A light being struck, a fire was kindled, whose blaze afforded some degree of cheerfulness, and no small comfort, for though the day had been hot, the night air of this mountainous region was chilling. A fire was partly necessary also to keep off the wolves with which these wilds were infested. Provisions being spread upon a projection of the rock, the Count and his family partook of a supper, which, in a scene less rude, would certainly have been thought less excellent. When the repast was finished, Sainte-Foy, impatient for the moon, sauntered along the precipice to a point that fronted the east, but all was yet wrapped in gloom, and the silence of night was broken only by the murmuring of woods that waved far below, or by distant thunder, and now and then by the faint voices of the party he had quitted. He viewed with emotions of awful sublimity the long volumes of sulphurous clouds that floated along the upper and middle regions of the air, and the lightning that flashed from them, sometimes silently, and at others followed by sudden peals of thunder, which the mountains feebly prolonged, while the whole horizon and the abyss on which he stood were discovered in the momentary light. Upon the succeeding darkness, the fire which had been kindled in the cave threw a partial gleam, illumining some points of the opposite rocks and the summits of pine woods that hung beetling on the cliffs below, while their recesses seemed to frown in deeper shade. Sang-Froid stopped to observe the picture which the party in the cave presented, where the elegant form of Blanche was finely contrasted by the majestic figure of the Count, who was seated by her on a rude stone, and each was rendered more impressive by the grotesque habits and strong features of the guides and other attendants who were in the background of the piece. The effect of the light, too, was interesting. On the surrounding figures it threw a strong, though pale gleam, and glittered on their bright arms, while upon the foliage of a gigantic larch, that impended its shade over the cliffs above, appeared a red, dusky tint, deepening almost imperceptibly into the blackness of night. While Sang-Froid contemplated the scene, the moon, broad and yellow, rose over the eastern summits from among embattled clouds, and showed dimly the grandeur of the heavens, the mass of vapors that rolled halfway down the precipice beneath, and the doubtful mountains. What dreadful pleasure there to stand sublime, like shipwrecked mariner on desert coast, and view the enormous waste of vapor tossed in billows lengthening to the horizon round. The Minstrel. From this romantic reverie he was awakened by the voices of the guides repeating his name, which was reverberated from cliff to cliff till 100 tongues seemed to call him, when he soon quieted the fears of the Count and the Lady Blanche by returning to the cave. As the storm, however, seemed approaching, they did not quit their place of shelter, and the Count, seated between his daughter and Sang-Froid, endeavored to divert the fears of the former, and conversed on subjects relating to the natural history of the scene among which they wandered. He spoke of the mineral and fossil substances found in the depths of these mountains, the veins of marble and granite with which they abounded, the strata of shells discovered near their summits, many thousand fathom above the level of the sea, and at a vast distance from its present shore, of the tremendous chasms and caverns of the rocks, the grotesque form of the mountains, and the various phenomena that seemed to stamp upon the world the history of the deluge. From the natural history he descended to the mention of events and circumstances connected with the civil story of the Pyrenees, named some of the most remarkable fortresses which France and Spain had erected in the passes of these mountains, and gave a brief account of some celebrated sieges and encounters in early times, when ambition first frightened solitude from these her deep recesses, made her mountains, which before had echoed only to the torrent's roar, tremble with the clang of arms, and when man's first footsteps in her sacred haunts had left the print of blood. As Blanche sat, attentive to the narrative that rendered the scenes doubly interesting, and resigned to solemn emotion, while she considered that she was on the very ground once polluted by these events, her reverie was suddenly interrupted by a sound that came in the wind. It was the distant bark of a watchdog. The travellers listened with eager hope, and, as the wind blew stronger, fancied that the sound came from no great distance, and the guides, having little doubt that it proceeded from the inn they were in search of, the Count determined to pursue his way. The moon now afforded a stronger, though still an uncertain, light, as she moved among broken clouds, and the travellers, led by the sound, recommenced their journey along the brow of the precipice, preceded by a single torch that now contended with the moonlight, for the guides, believing they should reach the inn soon after sunset, had neglected to provide more. In silent caution they followed the sound, which was heard but at intervals, and which, after some time, entirely ceased. The guides endeavored, however, to point their course to the quarter whence it had issued, but the deep roaring of a torrent soon seized their attention, and presently they came to a tremendous chasm of the mountain, which seemed to forbid all further progress. Blanche alighted from her mule, as did the Count and Sang-Froid, while the guides traversed the edge in search of a bridge, which, however rude, might convey them to the opposite side. And they at length confessed, but the Count had begun to suspect that they had been for some time doubtful of their way, and were now certain only that they had lost it. At a little distance was discovered a rude and dangerous passage, formed by an enormous pine, which, thrown across the chasm, united the opposite precipices, and which had been felled, probably by the hunter, to facilitate his chase of the izzard or the wolf. The whole party, the guides excepted, shuddered at the prospect of crossing this alpine bridge, whose sides afforded no kind of defence, and from which to fall was to die. The guides, however, prepared to lead over the mules, while Blanche stood trembling on the brink, and listening to the roar of the waters, which were seen descending from the rocks above, overhung with lofty pines, and thence precipitating themselves into the deep abyss where their white surges gleamed faintly in the moonlight. The poor animals proceeded over this perilous bridge with instinctive caution, neither frightened by the noise of the cataract, or deceived by the gloom which the impending foliage threw athwart their way. It was now that the solitary torch, which had been hitherto of little service, was found to be an inestimable treasure, and Blanche, terrified, shrinking, but endeavouring to recollect all her firmness and presence of mind, preceded by her lover and supported by her father, followed the red gleam of the torch in safety to the opposite cliff. As they went on, the heights contracted and formed a narrow pass, at the bottom of which the torrent they had just crossed was heard to thunder. But they were again cheered by the bark of a dog keeping watch, perhaps over the flocks of the mountains, to protect them from the nightly descent of the wolves. The sound was much nearer than before, and while they rejoiced in the hope of soon reaching a place of repose, a light was seen to glimmer at a distance. It appeared at a height considerably above the level of their path, and was lost and seen again, as if the waving branches of trees sometimes excluded and then admitted its rays. The guides hallooed with all their strength, but the sound of no human voice was heard in return, and at length, as a more effectual means of making themselves known, they fired a pistol. But while they listened in anxious expectation, the noise of the explosion was alone heard echoing among the rocks, and it gradually sunk into silence, which no friendly hint of man disturbed. The light, however, that had been seen before, now became plainer, and soon after voices were heard indistinctly on the wind. But upon the guides repeating the call, the voices suddenly ceased, and the light disappeared. The Lady Blanche was now almost sinking beneath the pressure of anxiety, fatigue, and apprehension, and the united efforts of the Count and sang-froid could scarcely support her spirits. As they continued to advance, an object was perceived on a point of rock above, which the strong rays of the moon, then falling on it, appeared to be a watch-tower. The Count, from its situation and some other circumstances, had little doubt that it was such, and believing that the light had proceeded from thence, he endeavoured to reanimate his daughter's spirits by the near prospect of shelter and repose, which, however rude the accommodation, a ruined watch-tower might afford. "Numerous watch-towers have been erected among the Pyrenees," said the Count, anxious only to call Blanche's attention from the subject of her fears, "and the method by which they give intelligence of the approach of the enemy is, you know, by fires kindled on the summits of these edifices. Signals have thus sometimes been communicated from post to post along a frontier line of several hundred miles in length. Then, as occasion may require, the lurking armies emerge from their fortresses and forests, and march forth to defend perhaps the entrance of some grand pass, where, planting themselves on the heights, they assail their astonished enemies, who wind along the glen below, with fragments of the shattered cliff, and pour death and defeat upon them. The ancient forts and watch-towers, overlooking the grand passes of the Pyrenees, are carefully preserved, but some of those in inferior stations have been suffered to fall into decay, and are now frequently converted into the more peaceful habitation of the hunter or the shepherd, who, after a day of toil, retires hither, and, with his faithful dogs, forgets, near a cheerful blaze, the labour of the chase or the anxiety of collecting his wandering flocks, while he is sheltered from the nightly storm.
"But are they always thus peacefully inhabited?"
said the Lady Blanche. "No," replied the Count. "They are sometimes the asylum of French and Spanish smugglers, who cross the mountains with contraband goods from their respective countries, and the latter are particularly numerous, against whom strong parties of the King's troops are sometimes sent. But the desperate resolution of these adventurers, who, knowing that if they are taken they must expiate the breach of the law by the most cruel death, travel in large parties, well armed, often daunts the courage of the soldiers. The smugglers, who seek only safety, never engage when they can possibly avoid it. The military also, who know that in these encounters danger is certain, and glory almost unattainable, are equally reluctant to fight. An engagement, therefore, very seldom happens, but when it does, it never concludes till after the most desperate and bloody conflict. You are inattentive, Blanche," added the Count. "I have wearied you with a dull subject. But see yonder, in the moonlight, is the edifice we have been in search of, and we are fortunate to be so near it before the storm bursts." Blanche, looking up, perceived that they were at the foot of the cliff on whose summit the building stood, but no light now issued from it. The barking of the dog, too, had for some time ceased, and the guides began to doubt whether this was really the object of their search. From the distance at which they surveyed it, shown imperfectly by a cloudy moon, it appeared to be of more extent than a single watch-tower, but the difficulty was how to ascend the height, whose abrupt declivities seemed to afford no kind of pathway. While the guides carried forward the torch to examine the cliff, the Count, remaining with Blanche and Sang-Froid at its foot, under the shadow of the woods, endeavoured again to beguile the time by conversation, but again anxiety abstracted the mind of Blanche, and he then consulted apart with Sang-Froid whether it would be advisable, should a path be found, to venture to an edifice which might possibly harbour banditti. They considered that their own party was not small, and that several of them were well armed. And after enumerating the dangers to be incurred by passing the night in the open wild, exposed perhaps to the effects of a thunderstorm, there remained not a doubt that they ought to endeavour to obtain admittance to the edifice above at any hazard respecting the inhabitants it might harbour. But the darkness and the dead silence that surrounded it appeared to contradict the probability of its being inhabited at all. A shout from the guides aroused their attention, after which, in a few minutes, one of the Count's servants returned with intelligence that a path was found, and they immediately hastened to join the guides, when they all ascended a little winding way cut in the rock among the thickets of dwarfwood, and, after much toil and some danger, reached the summit, where several ruined towers, surrounded by a massy wall, rose to their view, partially illumined by the moonlight. The space around the building was silent and apparently forsaken, but the Count was cautious. "Step softly," said he in a low voice, "while we reconnoitre the edifice." Having proceeded silently along for some paces, they stopped at a gate whose portals were terrible even in ruins, and, after a moment's hesitation, passed on to the court of entrance, but paused again at the head of a terrace which, branching from it, ran along the brow of a precipice. Over this rose the main body of the edifice, which was now seen to be not a watch-tower, but one of those ancient fortresses that from age and neglect had fallen to decay. Many parts of it, however, appeared to still be entire. It was built of grey stone in the heavy Saxon Gothic style, with enormous round towers, buttresses of proportionable strength, and the arch of the large gate, which seemed to open into the hall of the fabric, was round, as was that of a window above. The air of solemnity which must so strongly have characterized the pile, even in the days of its early strength, was now considerably heightened by its shattered battlements and half-demolished walls, and by the huge masses of ruin scattered in its wide area, now silent and grass-grown. In this court of entrance stood the gigantic remains of an oak that seemed to have flourished and decayed with the building, which it still appeared frowningly to protect by the few remaining branches, leafless and moss-grown, that crowned its trunk, and whose wide extent told how enormous the tree had been in a former age. This fortress was evidently once of great strength, and from its situation on a point of rock impending over a deep glen, had been of great power to annoy as well as to resist. The Count, therefore, as he stood surveying it, was somewhat surprised that it had been suffered, ancient as it was, to sink into ruins, and its present lonely and deserted air excited in his breast emotions of melancholy awe. While he indulged for a moment these emotions, he thought he heard a sound of remote voices steal upon the stillness from within the building, the front of which he again surveyed with scrutinizing eyes, but yet no light was visible. He now determined to walk round the fort to the remote part of it whence he thought the voices had arisen, that he might examine whether any light could be discerned there, before he ventured to knock at the gate. For this purpose he entered upon the terrace, where the remains of cannon were yet apparent in the thick walls. But he had not proceeded many paces when his steps were suddenly arrested by the loud barking of a dog within, and which he fancied to be the same whose voice had been the means of bringing the travellers thither. It now appeared that the place was inhabited, and the Count returned to consult again with sang-froid whether he should try to obtain admittance, for its wild aspect had somewhat shaken his former resolution, but after a second consultation he submitted to the considerations which before determined him, and which were strengthened by the discovery of the dog that guarded the fort, as well as by the stillness that pervaded it. He therefore ordered one of his servants to knock at the gate, who was advancing to obey him, when a light appeared through the loophole of one of the towers, and the Count called loudly, but receiving no answer, he went up to the gate himself, and struck upon it with an iron-pointed pole, which had assisted him to climb the steep. When the echoes had ceased that this blow had awakened, the renewed barking, and there were now more than one dog, was the only sound that was heard. The Count stepped back a few paces to observe whether the light was in the tower, and perceiving that it was gone, he returned to the portal, and had lifted the pole to strike again, when again he fancied he heard the murmur of voices within, and paused to listen. He was confirmed in the supposition, but they were too remote to be heard otherwise than in a murmur, and the Count now let the pole fall heavily upon the gate, when almost immediately a profound silence followed. It was apparent that the people within had heard the sound, and their caution in admitting strangers gave him a favorable opinion of them. "They are either hunters or shepherds," said he, "who, like ourselves, have probably sought shelter from the night within these walls, and are fearful of admitting strangers, lest they should prove robbers. I will endeavor to remove their fears." So saying, he called aloud, "We are friends who ask shelter from the night." In a few moments steps were heard within, which approached, and a voice then inquired, "Who calls?" "Friends," repeated the Count, "open the gates, and you shall know more." Strong bolts were now heard to be undrawn, and a man, armed with the hunting spear, appeared.
"What is it you want at this hour?"
said he. The Count beckoned his attendants, and then answered that he wished to inquire the way to the nearest cabin.
"Are you so little acquainted with these mountains," said the man, "as not to know that there is none within several leagues? I cannot show you the way. You must seek it. There's a moon."
Saying this, he was closing the gate, and the Count was turning away half disappointed and half afraid, when another voice was heard from above, and on looking up, he saw a light and a man's face at the grate of the portal.
"Stay, friend, you have lost your way," said the voice. "You are hunters, I suppose, like ourselves. I will be with you presently."
The voice ceased, and the light disappeared. Blanche had been alarmed by the appearance of the man who had opened the gate, and she now entreated her father to quit the place, but the Count had observed the hunter's spear which he carried, and the words from the tower encouraged him to await the event. The gate was soon opened, and several men in hunters' habits, who had heard above what had passed below, appeared, and having listened some time to the Count, told him he was welcome to rest there for the night. They then pressed him, with much courtesy, to enter and to partake of such fare as they were about to sit down to. The Count, who had observed them attentively while they spoke, was cautious and somewhat suspicious, but he was also wary, fearful of the approaching storm, and of encountering alpine heights in the obscurity of night. Being likewise somewhat confident in the strength and number of his attendants, he, after some further considerations, determined to accept the invitation. With this resolution he called his servants, who, advancing round the tower, behind which some of them had silently listened to this conference, followed their lord, the Lady Blanche, and Sang-Froid into the fortress. The strangers led them on to a large and rude hall, partially seen by a fire that blazed at its extremity, round which 4 men in the hunter's dress were seated, and on the hearth were several dogs stretched in sleep. In the middle of the hall stood a large table, and over the fire some part of an animal was boiling. As the Count approached, the men arose, and the dogs, half raising themselves, looked fiercely at the strangers, but on hearing their masters' voices, kept their postures on the hearth. Blanche looked round this gloomy and spacious hall, then at the men, and to her father, who, smiling cheerfully at her, addressed himself to the hunters. "This is a hospitable hearth," said he. "The blaze of a fire is reviving after having wandered so long in these dreary wilds. Your dogs are tired. What success have you had?"
"Such as we usually have," replied one of the men who had been seated in the hall. "We kill our game with tolerable certainty." "These are the fellow hunters," said one of the men who had brought the Count hither, "that have lost their way, and I have told them there is room enough in the fort for us all." "Very true," replied his companion. "What luck have you had in the chase, brothers? We have killed 2 izzards, and that, you will say, is pretty well."
"You mistake, friend," said the Count. "We are not hunters, but travellers. But if you will admit us to hunters' fare, we shall be well contented, and will repay your kindness."
"Sit down, then, brother," said one of the men. "Jacques, lay more fuel on the fire. The kid will soon be ready. Bring a seat for the lady, too. Mamselle, will you taste our brandy? It is true Barcelona, and as bright as ever flowed from a keg." Blanche timidly smiled, and was going to refuse, when her father prevented her, by taking, with a good-humoured air, the glass offered to his daughter, and Monsieur Sang-Froid, who was seated next to her, pressed her hand, and gave her an encouraging look. But her attention was engaged by a man who sat silently by the fire, observing Sang-Froid with a steady and earnest eye. "You lead a jolly life here," said the Count. "The life of a hunter is a pleasant and healthy one, and the repose is sweet which succeeds to your labour." "Yes," replied one of his hosts, "our life is pleasant enough. We live here only during the summer and autumnal months. In winter the place is dreary, and the swollen torrents that descend from the heights put a stop to the chase."
"'Tis a life of liberty and enjoyment," said the Count. "I should like to pass a month in your way very well." "We find employment for our guns, too," said a man who stood behind the Count. "Here are plenty of birds of delicious flavour, that feed upon the wild thyme and herbs that grow in the valleys. Now I think of it, there is a brace of birds hung up in the stone gallery. Go fetch them, Jacques. We will have them dressed." The Count now made enquiry concerning the method of pursuing the chase among the rocks and precipices of these romantic regions, and was listening to a curious detail, when a horn was sounded at the gate. Blanche looked timidly at her father, who continued to converse on the subject of the chase, but whose countenance was somewhat expressive of anxiety, and who often turned his eyes towards that part of the hall nearest the gate. The horn sounded again, and a loud halloo succeeded.
"There are some of our companions returned from their day's labor,"
said a man, going lazily from his seat towards the gate, and in a few minutes 2 men appeared, each with a gun over his shoulder and pistols in his belt.
"What cheer, my lads, what cheer?" said they as they approached. "What luck?" returned their companions. "Have you brought home your supper? You shall have none else." "Ha! Who the devil have you brought home?" said they in bad Spanish, on perceiving the Count's party. "Are they from France or Spain? Where did you meet with them?"
"They met with us, and a merry meeting too," replied his companion aloud, in good French.
"This chevalier and his party had lost their way, and asked a night's lodging in the fort."
The others made no reply, but threw down a kind of knapsack, and drew forth several brace of birds. The bag sounded heavily as it fell to the ground, and the glitter of some bright metal within glanced on the eye of the Count, who now surveyed with a more inquiring look the man that held the knapsack. He was a tall, robust figure of a hard countenance, and had short black hair curling on his neck. Instead of the hunter's dress, he wore a faded military uniform. Sandals were laced on his broad legs, and a kind of short trousers hung from his waist. On his head he wore a leathern cap, somewhat resembling in shape an ancient Roman helmet, but the brows that scowled beneath it would have characterized those of the barbarians who conquered Rome rather than those of a Roman soldier. The Count at length turned away his eyes and remained silent and thoughtful, till, again raising them, he perceived a figure standing in an obscure part of the hall, fixed in attentive gaze on Sainte-Foy, who was conversing with Blanche, and did not observe this. But the Count, soon after, saw the same man looking over the shoulder of the soldier as attentively at himself. He withdrew his eye when that of the Count met it, who felt mistrust gathering fast upon his mind, but feared to betray it in his countenance, and, forcing his features to assume a smile, addressed Blanche on some indifferent subject. When he again looked round, he perceived that the soldier and his companion were gone. The man who was called Jacques now returned from the stone gallery.
"The fire is lighted there," said he, "and the birds are dressing. The table, too, is spread there, for that place is warmer than this."
His companions approved of the removal, and invited their guests to follow to the gallery, of whom Blanche appeared distressed and remained silent. And Sainte-Foy looked at the Count, who said he preferred the comfortable blaze of the fire he was then near. The hunters, however, commended the warmth of the other apartment, and pressed his removal with such seeming courtesy that the Count, half doubting and half fearful of betraying his doubts, consented to go. The long and ruinous passages through which they went somewhat daunted him, but the thunder which now burst in loud peals above made it dangerous to quit this place of shelter, and he forbore to provoke his conductors by showing that he distrusted them. The hunters led the way with the lamp. The Count and Sainte-Foy, who wished to please their hosts by some instances of familiarity, carried each a seat, and Blanche followed with faltering steps. As she passed on, part of her dress caught on a nail in the wall, and while she stopped, somewhat too scrupulously to disengage it, the Count, who was talking to Sainte-Foy, and neither of whom observed the circumstance, followed their conductor round an abrupt angle of the passage, and Blanche was left behind in darkness. The thunder prevented them from hearing her call, but having disengaged her dress, she quickly followed, as she thought, the way they had taken. A light that glimmered at a distance confirmed this belief, and she proceeded towards an open door whence it issued, conjecturing that the room beyond be the stone gallery the men had spoken of. Hearing voices as she advanced, she paused within a few paces of the chamber, that she might be certain whether she was right, and from thence, by the light of a lamp that hung from the ceiling, observed 4 men seated round a table, over which they leaned in apparent consultation. In one of them she distinguished the features of him whom she had observed gazing at Sainte-Foy with such deep attention, and who was now speaking in an earnest though restrained voice, till one of his companions seeming to oppose him, they spoke together in a loud and harsher tone. Blanche, alarmed by perceiving that neither her father or sang-froid were there, and terrified at the fierce countenances and manners of these men, was turning hastily from the chamber to pursue her search of the gallery, when she heard one of the men say, "Let all dispute end here. Who talks of danger? Follow my advice, and there will be none. Secure them, and the rest are an easy prey." Blanche, struck with these words, paused a moment to hear more. "There is nothing to be got by the rest," said one of his companions. "I am never for blood when I can help it. Dispatch the 2 others, and our business is done. The rest may go." "May they so!" exclaimed the first ruffian, with a tremendous oath. "What, to tell how we have disposed of their masters, and to send the king's troops to drag us to the wheel? You were always a choice adviser. I warrant we have not yet forgot St. Thomas's Eve last year." Blanche's heart now sunk with horror. Her first impulse was to retreat from the door, but when she would have gone, her trembling frame refused to support her, and, having tottered a few paces to a more obscure part of the passage, she was compelled to listen to the dreadful counsels of those who, she was no longer suffered to doubt, were banditti. In the next moment she heard the following words: "Why, would you not murder the whole gang?" "I warrant our lives are as good as theirs," replied his comrade. "If we don't kill them, they will hang us. Better they should die than we should be hanged." "Better, better," cried his comrades. "To commit murder is a hopeful way of escaping the gallows," said the first ruffian. "Many an honest fellow has run his head into the noose that way, though." There was a pause of some moments, during which they appeared to be considering. "Confound those fellows!" exclaimed one of the robbers impatiently. "They ought to have been here by this time. They will come back presently with the old story and no booty. If they were here, our business would be plain and easy. I see we shall not be able to do the business tonight, for our numbers are not equal to the enemy, and in the morning they will be for marching off, and how can we detain them without force?" "I have been thinking of a scheme that will do," said one of his comrades. "If we can dispatch the 2 chevaliers silently, it will be easy to master the rest." "That's a plausible scheme, in good faith," said another with a smile of scorn. "If I can eat my way through the prison wall, I shall be at liberty. How can we dispatch them silently?" "By poison," replied his companions. "Well said, that will do," said the second ruffian. "That will give a lingering death too, and satisfy my revenge. These barons shall take care how they again tempt our vengeance." "I knew the son the moment I saw him," said the man whom Blanche had observed, gazing on sang-froid, "though he does not know me. The father I had almost forgotten." "Well, you may say what you will," said the third ruffian, "but I don't believe he is the baron, and I am as likely to know as any of you, for I was one of them that attacked him with our brave lads that suffered." "And was not I another?" said the first ruffian. "I tell you he is the baron. But what does it signify whether he is or not? Shall we let all this booty go out of our hands? It is not often we have such luck as this. While we run the chance of the wheel for smuggling a few pounds of tobacco, to cheat the king's manufactory, and of breaking our necks down the precipices in the chase of our food, and now and then rob a brother smuggler or a straggling pilgrim of what scarcely repays us the powder we fire at them. Shall we let such a prize as this go? Why, they have enough about them to keep us for—" "I am not for that, I am not for that," replied the third robber. "Let us make the most of them. Only, if this is the baron, I shall like to have a flash the more at him, for the sake of our brave comrades that he brought to the gallows." "Ay, ay, flash as much as you will," rejoined the first man, "but I tell you the baron is a taller man." "Confound your quibbling," said the second ruffian. "Shall we let them go or not? If we stay here much longer, they will take the hint and march off without our leave. Let them be who they will, they are rich, or why all those servants? Did you see the ring he whom you call the baron had on his finger? It was a diamond, but he has not got it on now. He saw me looking at it, I warrant, and took it off." "Ay, and then there is the picture. Did you see that? She has not taken that off," observed the first ruffian. "It hangs at her neck. If it had not sparkled so, I should not have found it out.
for it was almost hid by her dress. Those are diamonds too, and a rare many of them there must be to go round such a large picture."
"But how are we to manage this business?" said the second ruffian. "Let us talk of that. There is no fear of there being booty enough, but how are we to secure it?"
"Aye, aye," said his comrades, "let us talk of that, and remember no time is to be lost." "I am still for poison," observed the third, "but consider their number. Why, there are 9 or 10 of them, and armed too. When I saw so many at the gate, I was not for letting them in, you know, nor you either."
"I thought they might be some of our enemies," replied the second. "I did not so much mind numbers."
"But you must mind them now," rejoined his comrade, "or it will be worse for you. We are not more than 6, and how can we master 10 by open force? I tell you we must give some of them a dose, and the rest may then be managed."
"I'll tell you a better way," rejoined the other impatiently. "Draw closer." Blanche, who had listened to this conversation in an agony which it would be impossible to describe, could no longer distinguish what was said, for the ruffians now spoke in lowered voices. But the hopes that she might save her friends from the plot, if she could find her way quickly to them, suddenly reanimated her spirits, and lent her strength enough to turn her steps in search of the gallery. Terror, however, and darkness conspired against her, and having moved a few yards, the feeble light that issued from the chamber no longer even contended with the gloom, and her foot stumbling over a step that crossed the passage, she fell to the ground. The noise startled the banditti, who became suddenly silent, and then all rushed into the passage to examine whether any person was there who might have overheard their counsels. Blanche saw them approaching, and perceived their fierce and eager looks, but before she could raise herself, they discovered and seized her, and as they dragged her towards the chamber they had quitted, her screams drew from them horrible threatenings. Having reached the room, they began to consult what they should do with her. "Let us first know what she has heard," said the chief robber. "How long have you been in the passage, lady, and what brought you there?" "Let us first secure that picture," said one of his comrades, approaching the trembling Blanche. "Fair lady, by your leave, that picture is mine. Come, surrender it, or I shall seize it." Blanche, entreating their mercy, immediately gave up the miniature, while another of the ruffians fiercely interrogated her concerning what she had heard of their conversation, when, her confusion and terror too plainly telling what her tongue feared to confess, the ruffians looked expressively upon one another, and 2 of them withdrew to a remote part of the room, as if to consult further. "These are diamonds, by St. Peter!" exclaimed the fellow who had been examining the miniature. "And here is a very pretty picture too, faith, as handsome a young chevalier as you could wish to see by a summer's sun. Lady, this is your spouse, I warrant, for it is the spark that was in your company just now." Blanche, sinking with terror, conjured him to have pity on her, and delivering him her purse, promised to say nothing of what had passed, if he would suffer her to return to her friends. He smiled ironically, and was going to reply, when his attention was called off by a distant noise, and while he listened, he grasped the arm of Blanche more firmly, as if he feared she would escape from him, and she again shrieked for help. The approaching sounds called the ruffians from the other part of the chamber. "We are betrayed," said they, "but let us listen a moment. Perhaps it is only our comrades come in from the mountains, and if so, our work is sure. Listen." A distant discharge of shot confirmed this supposition for a moment, but in the next, the former sounds drawing nearer, the clashing of swords, mingled with the voices of loud contention, and with heavy groans, were distinguished in the avenue leading to the chamber. While the ruffians prepared their arms, they heard themselves called by some of their comrades afar off, and then a shrill horn was sounded without the fortress, a signal, it appeared, they too well understood, for 3 of them, leaving the Lady Blanche to the care of the 4th, instantly rushed from the chamber. While Blanche, trembling and nearly fainting, was supplicating for release, she heard amid the tumult that approached the voice of Sang-Froid, and she had scarcely renewed her shriek when the door of the room was thrown open, and he appeared, much disfigured with blood, and pursued by several ruffians. Blanche neither saw nor heard any more. Her head swam, her sight failed, and she became senseless in the arms of the robber who had detained her. When she recovered, she perceived by the gloomy light that trembled round her that she was in the same chamber, but neither the Count Saint Foix or any other persons appeared, and she continued for some time entirely still, and nearly in a state of stupefaction. But the dreadful images of the past returning, she endeavoured to raise herself, that she might seek her friends, when a sullen groan at a little distance reminded her of Saint Foix, and of the condition in which she had seen him enter this room. Then, starting from the floor, by a sudden effort of horror, she advanced to the place whence the sound had proceeded, where a body was lying stretched upon the pavement, and where, by the glimmering light of a lamp, she discovered the pale and disfigured countenance of Saint Foix. Her horrors at that moment may be easily imagined. He was speechless, his eyes were half closed, and on the hand which she grasped in the agony of despair, cold damps had settled. While she vainly repeated his name and called for assistance, steps approached, and a person entered the chamber, who she soon perceived was not the Count, her father. But what was her astonishment when, supplicating him to give assistance to Saint Foix, she discovered Ludovico! He scarcely paused to recognize her, but immediately bound up the wounds of the Chevalier, and, perceiving that he had fainted, probably from loss of blood, ran for water. But he had been absent only a few moments when Blanche heard other steps approaching, and while she was almost frantic with apprehension of the ruffians, the light of a torch flashed upon the walls, and then Count de Villefort appeared, with an affrighted countenance and breathless with impatience, calling upon his daughter. At the sound of his voice she rose and ran to his arms, while he, letting fall the bloody sword he had held, pressed her to his bosom in a transport of gratitude and joy, and then hastily inquired for Saint Foix, who now gave some signs of life. Ludovico soon after returning with water and brandy, the former was applied to his lips, and the latter to his temples and hands, and Blanche at length saw him unclose his eyes, and then heard him inquire for her. But the joy she felt on this occasion was interrupted by new alarms, when Ludovico said it would be necessary to remove Monsieur Saint Foix immediately, and added, "The banditti that are out, my lord, were expected home an hour ago, and they will certainly find us if we delay. That shrill horn, they know, is never sounded by their comrades but on most desperate occasions, and it echoes among the mountains for many leagues round. I have known them brought home by its sound, even from the Pied de Melican. Is anybody standing watch at the great gate, my lord?"
"Nobody," replied the Count. "The rest of my people are now scattered about. I scarcely know where. Go, Ludovico, collect them together, and look out yourself, and listen if you hear the feet of mules."
Ludovico then hurried away, and the Count consulted as to the means of removing Saint Foix, who could not have borne the motion of a mule, even if his strength would have supported him in the saddle. While the Count was telling that the banditti, whom they had found in the fort, were secured in the dungeons, Blanche observed that he was himself wounded, and that his left arm was entirely useless. But he smiled at her anxiety, assuring her the wound was trifling. The Count's servants, except two who kept watch at the gate, now appeared, and soon after Ludovico. "I think I hear mules coming along the glen, my lord," said he, "but the roaring of the torrent below will not let me be certain. However, I have brought what will serve the Chevalier," he added, showing a bear skin fastened to a couple of long poles, which had been adapted for the purpose of bringing home such of the banditti as happened to be wounded in their encounters. Ludovico spread it on the ground, and, placing the skins of several goats upon it, made a kind of bed, into which the Chevalier, who was, however, now much revived, was gently lifted, and the poles being raised upon the shoulders of the guides, whose footing among these steeps could best be depended upon, he was borne along with an easy motion. Some of the Count's servants were also wounded, but not materially, and their wounds being bound up, they now followed to the great gate. As they passed along the hall, a loud tumult was heard at some distance, and Blanche was terrified. "It is only those villains in the dungeon, my lady," said Ludovico.
"They seem to be bursting it open," said the Count.
"No, my lord," replied Ludovico, "it has an iron door,
We have nothing to fear from them, but let me go first and look out from the rampart."
They quickly followed him, and found their mules browsing before the gates, where the party listened anxiously, but heard no sound except that of the torrent below, and of the early breeze sighing among the branches of the old oak that grew in the court. And they were now glad to perceive the first tints of dawn over the mountain tops. When they had mounted their mules, Ludovico, undertaking to be their guide, led them by an easier path than that by which they had formerly ascended into the glen.
"We must avoid that valley to the east, my lord," said he, "or we may meet the banditti. They went out that way in the morning."
The travellers soon after quitted this glen, and found themselves in a narrow valley that stretched towards the northwest. The morning light upon the mountains now strengthened fast, and gradually discovered the green hillocks that skirted the winding feet of the cliffs, tufted with cork-tree and evergreen oak. The thunderclouds, being dispersed, had left the sky perfectly serene, and Blanche was revived by the fresh breeze and by the view of verdure which the late rain had brightened. Soon after, the sun arose, when the dripping rocks, with the shrubs that fringed their summits, and many a turfy slope below, sparkled in his rays. A wreath of mist was seen floating along the extremity of the valley, but the gale bore it before the travellers, and the sunbeams gradually drew it up towards the summit of the mountains. They had proceeded about a league, when Sainte-Foy, having complained of extreme faintness, they stopped to give him refreshment, and that the men who had bore him might rest. Ludovico had brought from the fort some flasks of rich Spanish wine, which now proved a reviving cordial not only to Sainte-Foy, but to the whole party, though to him it gave only a temporary relief, for it fed the fever that burned in his veins, and he could neither disguise in his countenance the anguish he suffered, or suppress the wish that he was arrived at the inn where they had designed to pass the preceding night. While they thus reposed themselves under the shade of the dark green pines, the Count desired Ludovico to explain shortly by what means he had disappeared from the north apartment, how he came into the hands of the banditti, and how he had contributed so essentially to serve him and his family, for to him he justly attributed their present deliverance. Ludovico was going to obey him, when suddenly they heard the echo of a pistol-shot from the way they had passed, and they rose in alarm, hastily to pursue their route.